Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Welcome to the DMZ, everyone.
I don't see I don't see the Orioles hat today. I'm looking through my wormhole, and you seem hatless. What possibly could have transpired for you to have abandoned your team so quickly?
Well, I haven't abandoned them, but the mighty have fallen, Bill. A week ago, the full of optimism, full of hope. We taped this on Thursday. I actually went to the game Friday night at Camden Yards and sat in the rain as the Orioles lost in 10 innings to the Kansas City Royals, and here we are a week later, and they just lost again, a 2-1 loss. So they got swept, lost 4 straight games, but at least 2 of them were decided by 1 run, and I think 2 of them were extra inning games. So close, but not close. But yes, this is, and I think losing builds character, and so maybe you look at the bright side of things.
Well, I would say losing builds character, but these days these teams seem to lose and they get busted up. So there's no institutional memory of the character building to carry you into the next year.
That happens sometimes. It's not going to happen with the Orioles. They just re-signed J.J. Hardy, in fact, for 3 years, I think, during the playoff run. I think they're going to be able to keep the team together. There aren't a lot of huge stars anyway. That's one of the good things about one of the interesting things about the Orioles. This will sound like sour grapes or something, but 3 of their best players were out during this playoff run. Machado, Wieters, and Adam Jones, who was busted for Adderall. The other two were actually injured, and Jones for taking Adderall. So, which is you can get a waiver to play if you're on it, but he did not go through the proper channels. So that's my little asterisk to why they lost. But I think I think it'll be fine. I'm actually now rooting for the Kansas City Royals.
You're rooting for the team that extinguished your dreams?
Yes.
Don't you want to see them get? Don't you want to see them get humiliated on the big stage now?
Well, there is. I mean, I would be lying if I didn't confess it. There is a side of me that would love to see that happen, but you push past that. I mean, the Kansas City Royals. I guess a couple things. One, let's say they go all the way to the World Series and they win decisively. Well, that could mean that the Orioles were the second best team in baseball. And as an American League fan, sort of predominantly, you root for the American League team. The other thing, though, Bill, is frankly,
you league loyalty. You love the Disney hero that much?
Well, no, I think that more importantly, it is the fact that the Kansas City Royals are a small market team like the Baltimore Orioles, and the last time the Orioles won the World Series was 1983, and the last time the Royals won the World Series was 1985. And so I think it's appropriate to sort of root for these teams who haven't been in the show for 30 or so years. Unlike the San Francisco Giants and the St. Louis Cardinals, who have been there repeatedly. By the way, I want to correct something. I think I said earlier, did I say it was Adam Jones or Chris Davis? It was Chris Davis who took the Adderall. I don't know if I said Adam Jones or Chris Davis. It's Chris Davis who took the Adderall, if I got it wrong earlier. But anyway, no, I think you root for the Kansas City Royals because it's been since 1985, and I think it's time.
And obviously I believe the San Francisco Giants are the ones likely to face the Royals. This is not some crusade against San Francisco values, is it? This is not you waving the banner of Middle America against the heathens of the West Coast.
Not in this case, Bill. I think I might have made that argument. I think if you go back a year or two, I probably wrote a column about something like that. But But in this case, I think I wrote a column a year or two ago, sort of like why we should be rooting for Detroit over San Francisco or something to that effect. No, this time around, it's just, Kansas City, flyover country. And, it harkens back to the nostalgia of my youth, with George Brett and Dan Quisenberry and
Pine Tar.
The Pine Tar Incident, which I think would be a great name of a band. If the Pine Tar Incident would be a great band name. But so, look, it's not the Orioles, but I think you root for the Royals, the underdog. And here's the thing, though. The Royals have this kind of magic happening. And fighting them was like fighting an insurgency, basically. The Orioles came in kind of with what you would think of as overwhelming force. And the Royals managed to just eke out a win every game by, in some cases, guerrilla warfare, bunting, stealing bases, all sorts of stuff like that. And they've really gotten lucky. A lot of infield, ground balls that they beat, they sort of run out for a hit, or little bloopers right over somebody's head that just happen to magically fall in at the right place. Can they? So that's honestly, I never took them seriously. I underestimated them when they beat Anaheim, and I thought can't do that again. That was luck. Well, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. And at some point, you start to wonder, like, is this a destiny thing? Is this a magical thing that this is Kansas City's year? Can they keep it up, or will their luck run out? To be continued.
Well, I get the sense that there are a lot of Republicans out there that think the Senate is their destiny right now.
Nice segue there. I like
thank you. I feel this is like October 2012. There's this sort of sense of inevitability on the Republican side. We have to win. The polls are all looking our way. There's no way Democrats can pull off that turnout trick again. Is there a chance perhaps they're getting a little bit ahead of themselves right now?
Well, I think you always have to be, cognizant that things could change. And as Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. But, it certainly looks good for Republicans. And I would say that it looks better for them than it did a week or two ago. I think that, I've sort of been consistent in saying that, midterm elections usually go away from the party, the president's party. That's probably especially true of second terms, that, Democrats, just by virtue of the way that things happened, they were defending an inordinate amount of red state seats that Democrats had won 6 years earlier, in some cases, or had just, the districts had changed, places like Arkansas, where, Mitt Romney and John McCain both, beat Barack Obama in some of these states, and now Democrats in this environment. I would say that in the past week it's gotten even worse because of the sort of fears of Ebola and ISIS. I would say that right now you're seeing an even more toxic environment for Democrats to try to maintain power.
Yeah, I see Republicans, having these ads that really play up, world falling apart, threats everywhere, ISIS on the border of Mexico, and I guess we haven't seen a lot of Ebola ads yet, but you're seeing a bubbling up on the right saying, why isn't there a travel ban? Which all the public health professionals say is not a good idea. So maybe that will get into ads sometime soon. It strikes me as a bit of a bank shot to play up obviously those issues have people's attention right now, but it's hard to tie those issues to the local race and any of the voting record that the Senate candidates have. You see a little bit on the left trying to go after Republicans, saying you guys try to cut CDC spending, and then the pushback on that is that that's part of a sequestration. Obama's complicit in that too, and that kind of muddies the water for that talking point. So I
think the Washington Post fact checker gave somebody some Democrat.
The Agenda
for
Project
Pinocchios.
the Agenda Project has an ad that they're running, at least in Kentucky. They want to do in other states. I thought the Washington Post fact checker was off the mark on that one because he hung his hat on this notion that sequestration was Obama's idea, which I think is sort of devoid of context. That idea was come up with in response to Republicans in 2011 holding the debt limit hostage. It's not like they thought it was an awesome idea.
No, I think they made that. I think you made that clear in the Post piece, though.
I wouldn't say it was that clear.
You're always bashing the mainstream media, Bill. I'm not gonna sit here and let you do that. Okay, look, I'd say a couple things to that. Number one, it certainly is interesting that this race is Republicans, I think, started off thinking Obamacare was going to be the big issue, and then maybe the economy, and now it's become, I think, this larger narrative about incompetence. I do think that some of this is very substantive. I think that number one, sort of from a philosophical standpoint, Obama's premise has always been that government can be a force for good, and that you ought to trust government. This just completely, the mishandling of ISIS and of Ebola sort of undermines that fundamental premise.
Are conservatives now asking government to do more? They're not talking about some sort of libertarian strategy to fight Ebola. They're asking for government to have stronger regulations and quicker responses. This is an argument for having more proactive and robust funding and more authority for public health institutions?
Well, I mean, look, I'm sure there's hypocrisy. There's no doubt about it. But I do think that they're gonna frame it as a matter of competence. Obama it's not a competent government, not doing the things you do. And speaking to that, I do think that it's not absurd to suggest some sort of a pause on travel from certain parts of Africa that where this Western Africa where this is obviously a huge problem. That doesn't strike me as an absurd thing to suggest, and I don't think it's necessarily playing politics to say that. I mean, but be that as it may, I do think it's interesting that you wouldn't have thought that the election would come down to this, and I think this is what's happening. It reminds me of 2002 with the sort of drumbeat leading up to the Iraq War, in the wake of 9/11 still, where you have Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Where the first thing you want to do is take care of your sort of primal needs, and then eventually you get up to self-actualization, right? Well, I think that conservatives tend to do well when you're focused on things like let's be secure, let's be safe, let's make sure those things. And there was a piece somebody wrote the other day, I think at National Journal, about how Ebola is making conservatives more conservative. Well, I don't think it's just conservative. I think Ebola is making everybody more conservative. And I think that, when everything's fine, when when you think all your needs are met, you have time to sort of get around to worrying about, some of these other issues that liberals really maybe excel. But if you're a soccer mom and you're worried about safety and security, that's different than if everything is going well and you sort of get around to worrying about birth control or something.
Well, I mean, I'm not with you that this is going to be the factor for the midterms, but just going on your premise, even if there is a swing towards the Republicans on a competence criteria, that doesn't follow that it's an embrace of conservatism. If Republicans are selling themselves as elect us to Congress because we'll enforce more competence, well, that sets a bar for Republicans to then be competent when they control Congress. And as I argued, last week, I'm not quite sure they're prepared to be all that competent when they're running Congress. The first thing they're going to have to do when they get to town is keep the government open and raise the debt limit. And I'm not sure they have a unified enough caucus to pull that off so easily. It could be a pretty Pyrrhic victory if they're trying to win on that basis. That's not really grounded in what their own ideology is.
No, I completely agree, Bill. I mean, if we could step back and look at the big picture, and I don't think Republicans know who they are yet. I don't think Republicans have, there are a lot of unsettled questions, and I don't think that they are running on a proactive message as much as we're not Obama. Obama's unpopular, vote for us. I actually think that they're doing the smart thing politically, if you care about winning in like 2 weeks or whatever, or 3 weeks. In November, but your point, I agree with your point. Your point is well taken, and it may be that that they're not prepared to handle victory. But I do think the competence issue is important. I mean, for a long time, Republicans sort of were seen as the daddy, sort of competent party. George W. Bush kind of destroyed that. I mean, Katrina being maybe the most obvious example of sort of governmental impotence and incompetence. And then I think they're willing to give Democrats a shot at it. And then I think, now we're maybe to a point. I'm not going to call it Obama's Katrina or whatever, because that's just such a tired trope at this point. I mean, people were talking about like the oil spill as being that. Maybe I wrote about it. Who knows? I got to write stuff here, folks. But look, I will say this. I think that people underestimate the political environment, meaning that I think that it's important that candidates run good campaigns, and it's important that they have smart answers to tough questions, and all of these things, the blocking and tackling, all these things matter on a campaign. And so you could have a really good candidate run a really good campaign and win a race he shouldn't have won. But I still think the political environment is probably underrated. Like if the political environment is ripe, it's like the Kansas City Royals. There was something magical happening. They just, every day they showed up and those balls drop. They just, these little bloopers, these dying quails, ground balls with eyes, whatever it is that Kevin Costner talks about in Bull Durham. They just, these little flares off the end of the bat. It just, something happened. I don't know what it is. I couldn't define it. You just knew the Kansas City Royals were going to roll over the Orioles at a certain, you sort of gave up hope at a certain point. I mean, one of the Royals players actually said this, and he was stupid to say it, but he was actually right. And I think that that's kind of how I feel right now about this election, that you just feel like the Republicans are the team of destiny for this election. But again, a week ago I was wearing an Orioles hat, Bill, and I sat here and I was pretty confident, and things turn around in the course of a week. I could be wrong.
Well, I mean, you're talking as if sort of like all the stars are aligning, and look, there are certainly good polls for Republicans in places like Colorado and Alaska and Arkansas and Louisiana, but at the same time, the map is not expanding into more blue territory. You haven't seen Oregon or Minnesota or Virginia become competitive. The races becoming more competitive are in the red states. It's Kansas and South Dakota and Georgia. And a lot of Republican governors are having a hard time, too.
What about Colorado? I mean, I would say Colorado.
I think Colorado is one of the things that's going in your way. But
right, but that's not a red state anymore.
Well, it's a purple state that's going in your direction as of today. I agree with that, but there's two dynamics going on here right now, is what I'm saying. That at the same time that the races that were targeted early in the season, those races are going in the Republicans' way, to a degree. But the races that are becoming competitive late in the game are the ones in the red states, not the ones in the blue states. So there's sort of these two different dynamics going on.
Yeah, I agree. It is a weird. We talked about it last week here. What's happening in South Dakota? What's happening in Kansas? It's a weird phenomenon. I think Republicans end up holding both. Coming out on both of those. I think I'm more confident in South Dakota than Kansas, actually. But
I think Georgia should be the Republicans' big worry right now.
Yeah, with none down there.
Well, I mean, David Perdue that's the biggest gaffe of the year. David Perdue. Well, he 9 years ago, which I don't fault him for 9 years ago. You didn't know he ran for office back then. He gives a legal deposition asked about his career in outsourcing. He says, "Yeah, I spent my whole career doing that." That gets uncovered a week ago, but instead of saying, that's when I was a businessman, and I've learned since then how hard this has been on American workers. I thought back then that the American economy would pick up the slack and it would raise our income, and that hasn't borne out to be true, and that's why I want to do X, Y, and Z. Instead, he goes out and says, "Defend it. I'm proud of it." You don't do that. You don't say you're proud of it. Well, look, here's
David Perdue. It is interesting. People forget. I mean, he's the same guy. I'm pretty sure he's the same guy who attacked his primary opponent for just being for only being like a high school graduate or something. I don't think he's beloved. He has he's got the same last name. He's related to the governor or the former governor or whatever.
Senator.
I've heard stories from powerful outside groups who wanted to meet with him and endorse him, and he seems like he might be a jerk, and I don't know if there's a lot of people rooting for him. It's a weird thing, but there's all this concern about the conservative sort of Tea Party candidates saying dumb things or being vulnerable, and you have Pat Roberts in Kansas, the establishment sort of moderate candidate who's now running to the right in order to try to get reelected. Obviously, and then you have Perdue, which is I think sort of a moderate alternative down there in Georgia, not running so well. I mean, this narrative needs to die. That if you just nominate the moderate establishment Republican candidate, that they'll coast to reelection or coast to victory in the case of Georgia, just does not bear out. Well,
I mean, but you're hitting upon something there. Roberts and Perdue are kind of running like jerks right now. I mean, Roberts
the jerk store called
right. He was asked in the debate, the both candidates in Kansas, can you say something nice for the other candidate? And the best Roberts can come up with is that Greg Orman dresses well, But Cory Gardner in Colorado, in that guy, and I'm not saying he's got the race in the bag, but I've talked about Republicans having a hard time reaching out to women. You've talked about Mitch McConnell actually doing better than expected with women. Cory Gardner in current polls has resolved the gender gap. I mean, there's still a gender gap, but it's worked in his favor. He's got a big lead with men and a smaller deficit with women. I mean, he's just running he's got a sunny disposition. He doesn't come across like a hater. He's renouncing some of his anti-abortion positions. The personhood initiative he said was wrong because it was going to curtail birth control. He claims to be for easy access to birth control now. And so the combination of his the personality that he's putting on in his ads, he's always upbeat, always smiling, combined with the calibration on issues, seems to be putting him in a very good position. And here in Massachusetts, which hasn't get as much attention, but there's a big Politico piece today called Martha Chokley, which I think is premature and unfair. Coakley is still up a few points in the race, but obviously not crushing it the way you might expect a blue candidate to do in Massachusetts. Charlie Baker, the Republican, also sunny guy, emphasizing that he's pro-choice, emphasizing that he has a gay brother, and that way he's cutting into the gender gap that is really fueling, say, Kay Hagan in North Carolina. That gender gap is a massive one, and it's tilting the race in her favor right now. So if Gardner pulls it out, if Baker pulls out, even Mitch McConnell, the race you've been following, McConnell's got ads I mean, he's not a sunny character, but he's got a couple ads up there that are pretty upbeat, that feature women talking in their own words. My point from a week ago that the old Eisenhower ads to women had women talking in their own words. McConnell's doing that in Kentucky. That's the model for Republicans to solve this problem, not wagging their finger.
Well, here's the thing, Bill. I think so much of life is about, like, okay, number one, if you're not a jerk, that helps, right? If you're a good person who cares about people and treats people well, that helps. And then the other thing is, frankly, if you do the work, if you actually, so in other words, you're not trying to fake it. You're not trying to run TV ads to bullshit people or pull the wool over their eyes, but you've actually been doing the work. And let's take Mitch McConnell, right? His latest ad, which I obtained exclusively at the Daily Caller, talks about how he co-sponsored the Debbie Smith Act. Now, what is the Debbie Smith Act? Debbie Smith is a woman who was, brutally raped. It took 6 years for them to figure out who did it because there was a backlog on DNA testing of rape kits. Mitch McConnell helped change that law, which would expedite, using this DNA evidence. He co-sponsored the Debbie Smith Act. She appeared in an ad for him where she stands in front of the camera and talks about McConnell's, quote, commitment to this, quote, commitment to this legislation speaks of his devotion to women, to crime victims, and to their families. This is something this guy did, years ago. And there's a litany of these issues. And when you've actually been doing things, doing your job and getting things done and trying to help people, then when people come after you and try to call you a misogynist or an old white guy who doesn't care about women, people are willing to step up and run TV ads talking about what you did for them, and you can put up something saying that you co-sponsored this legislation. Like, if you're a good person and you actually do a good job, somehow, this is surprising, but that actually at some point is also good politics. It pays off.
Well, but that should be a lesson to Republicans. McConnell's having to reach back, before Obama, before McConnell committed to an all-out obstruction strategy. He has to go back to the days when he was an earmarker, when he was a wheeler and dealer, and actually trying to get legislation passed and say, look, here's something I did. Here's a way I delivered for you as a constituent, and I have this constituent here who's going to tell you what I did. If he didn't have that phase of his career to lean on, and all he had was his obstruction phase, he wouldn't have that in his back pocket. He had to have been doing his job at some point, and so it muddies the narrative that Grimes is trying to put out there, saying now he is an obstructionist that is making Washington dysfunctional. But there are a number of Republicans in office who have never had that phase in their career, and if they get into one of these days, they won't have that to pull out of their back pocket.
So that's a good point, Bill. Look, I do think there's a lesson to be learned here. Obstruction isn't always a bad thing, but, there's nothing unconservative about getting stuff done that helps people. I think that they're part of the ethos, the sort of ethos of the Tea Party, sort of maybe unspoken, but it implied that if you were passing legislation, if you were getting things done, if you were doing constituent service, that was a somehow corrupt or that's the establishment, the old way of politics. But I think that, that's not the case. Now, we can have a discussion about whether or not earmarks are good, whether or not spending is good. And in the case of this particular bill with McConnell, it did, either direct or redirect funding toward expediting this DNA evidence, which I think seemingly was a good thing to do. So, yeah, maybe there is a lesson to learn. And if McConnell survives, and it looks like he will, then maybe people start taking notice.
And I think you also have this issue with a lot of conservative governors, having problems now. Sam Brownback's in a tough race in Kansas. Scott Walker's in a tough race in Wisconsin. Who knows how bad Rick Scott's going to lose now after his bizarre move last night. Getting persnickety about Charlie Crist's fan. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but that just seemed like for a guy in a tough race, why would you go threaten to walk out of the building over such a minor matter? I just think is utterly bizarre. And if all three of those guys went down. Even though Tom Tillis not a governor, the Republican Senate candidate in North Carolina, he's the Speaker of the House there. That state government's gone hard right, and that seems to be dragging him down in that Senate race in North Carolina. So you have the potential, even if Republicans take the Senate, evidence that hard right governing is not being blessed in this race.
Well, look, I mean, I think a couple of things here. One is, you could argue that if you really want to get reelected, the answer is to do nothing, offend nobody, and part of the reason we elect people is to take courageous stands and to use their political capital. And so, in the case of Scott Walker taking on the unions, I think that was probably a profile in courage. He's been rewarded by having to fend off 3 elections in 4 years, 3 tough elections in 4 years, including an attempt to recall him. If he survives, I think that becomes a badge of honor and helps him become, somewhat viable presidential candidate. You can argue that he won 3 times in a tough state like Wisconsin in the course of 4 years. He has shifted on gay marriage, though. I just wrote a piece at the Daily Caller sort of charting his evolution on that issue, so that's interesting. In the case,
and also he's got an abortion ad up where he says, that his law, maintains the decision between the woman and her doctor. This is a bill that has mandatory ultrasounds before you can get an abortion, but he's not emphasizing that part of it because he's getting hit pretty hard for being anti-abortion with no exception. So he's calibrating on a number of fronts.
Well, and you see, I think Mary Burke in Wisconsin, on the other hand, is in favor of late-term abortion. And so that could cut both ways. In Florida, for those who didn't see, there was this debate between Charlie Crist and Rick Scott, where Charlie Crist apparently had a fan under his podium or over his podium. I guess
it was at the foot of the podium, and actually Molly Ball at The Atlantic has a fantastic piece sort of tracing Charlie Crist's insistence for years. They always have a fan near him at all times, and it even came up in a debate where in that case the other guy insisted he get a fan too, or he wouldn't debate.
As someone said, I'm sure Richard Nixon would have loved to have a fan in 1960. Molly Ball's terrific, by the way. Everybody should read her stuff at The Atlantic. Look, I think it was a violation of the rules of the debate, but the question then is it smart to challenge it, right? So here's what probably happened. Everybody knows that Charlie Crist likes to have this fan. Maybe it keeps him from sweating and looking, the guy looks sketchy. The guy is sketchy. Maybe the fan helps to tamp down on that. I don't know. But so
as opposed to Rick Scott, who looks like everybody's best friend,
who looks like Mr. Burns. Let's be honest about this. But anyway, not that you and I are Brad Pitt and George Clooney. But anyway, we're not running for governor. But so anyway, so I'm guessing that Rick Scott's people knew this and that they intentionally tried to say no electronic devices, and that Crist people. I think Crist people won because you can break the rules of debate, and anybody who dares to challenge it looks like a wimp, or it's sort of like the victim gets victimized or gets attacked here. We saw Candy Crowley, the debate moderator, break the rules of an agreed upon debate. And yet, nobody's going to come to nobody but me really came to Mitt Romney's defense and said, well, we ought to honor, the agreed upon rules of a debate. In other words, I think to put it in Candy Crowley's, verbiage, Rick Scott was right in the main. You know what I mean? Like, Rick Scott, technically speaking, Rick Scott was right, but it was a stupid political move to try to challenge the little fan.
Just so folks know the particulars of this, so in the printed copy of the debate agreement, it says there'll be no electronics, parentheses, including fans, in parentheses, because when I first thought electronics, like, well, who would call a fan an electronic device? But they actually put it literally in the rule that encompasses fans. So the Scott people were like, Charlie Crist is not getting his fan. Like, they knew that was a thing. But Chris, and this is where I don't know if the Scott people knew this or not, but when Chris signed the agreement, they added a handwritten rider saying, but if temperature issues arise, debate organizers will provide a fan.
Wait, when you say a rider, this is just, he took a pen and, like, drew a little...
Right. Like, that's right.
I'm not sure... I mean, unless...
And it shows what I think. The written part, the printed part, said that the candidate would not bring a fan. So technically, if the debate organizers provided the fan, that would not be a violation of the rule. Well, and I don't know, again, if Scott knew any of this, if he was even aware of this. So this might have been a total blindside move on Chris' part.
Well, this tells you all you need to know about Charlie Crist, which is he cheats, he breaks the rules, he's very, sketchy, but he's a good politician. And I think he won the political game. And it's a very interesting race with, two candidates who are, in their own ways, unappealing, for different reasons, down in Florida. The other interesting point, Bill, is how does this all reflect on the RGA chairman, a fellow I like to call Governor Chris Christie? If Republicans lose, Sam Brownback in Kansas, Scott Walker, you go through, I think there are at least 4 of them who are in trouble, then what does that say anything about Chris Christie? Does that hamper his argument for election as president, if and when he runs?
I mean, Christie, I assume, is still going to want to say that he is, an electable mainstream Republican, not somebody on the fringe. And if a Brownback and a Walker go down, he can say, look, I was elected by 70%. These guys couldn't even get reelected. So obviously, I know something these guys don't. But I would think that his record in New Jersey is not so hot right now. Unemployment is higher than the national average. The right doesn't trust him because of how he worked with Obama during Hurricane Sandy. And he's got this whole tag of being a bully now. Even if there's no Bridgegate charges against him, I still think people still look at him as presiding over a government that look the other way at those sorts of tactics. So I have a hard time seeing how he breaks out in 2016. But I think the bigger question for Republicans is, we don't know exactly how the race is going to turn out. But I think if I was a Republican, I would try to be aware of these competing dynamics and be aware that not everything was falling in line. Even if I did win the Senate, that there are other things going on here that suggest, perhaps unadulterated conservatism is not the ticket to 2016. How do I meld what my core principles are with where the country is and to properly position for 2016, and how do I run the Congress in that respect? Maybe I got to find a way to not have another shutdown debacle. And how do I convince the Tea Party folks to be good soldiers this time around and not have this be a big dysfunctional mess? I mean, that's the kind of stuff I'd be worrying about right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to, like, are you a jerk? And do you put points on do you get stuff done? I mean, that was the theme of my show today, right?
So, like, let's look at Sam. Don't be a jerk. These are good operating principles.
It totally is. But look at Sam Brownback, right? Do you know why the real reason he's in trouble is he pushed through this tax cut in Kansas, which is good, in my opinion. then, but here's the catcher. There were, I don't know, several, 5 or 6 maybe, maybe more, I don't know, something like that. Several state representatives who didn't support his tax cut. He essentially recruits and or funds. He helps find challengers for them to run against them. That's ballsy. I mean, that's hardball right there,
And I think I mentioned in the past, FDR pulled that stunt in 1938 and it backfired miserably and probably put the end to the entire New Deal agenda.
Yeah. You should write this, Bill. This is a story, what Sam Brownback should have learned from FDR. This is a classic Bill. Wow. This is a Bill Scher piece. You can teach people about history and make it timely. I think you should write this piece.
Maybe I should.
Get on it, man. In fact, I literally just hit publish on it, so I've already beaten you to punch. I wrote it while I was stalling. Look, you can make that move. That's a move, and you can do it. But if you go there, you need to expect people, that there's going to be repercussions on that. It seems to me like you could be a conservative who gets things done and brings people along with you, but without pissing people off. It's a fine line, between being, on the other hand, anytime you do something, take a stand, you're gonna anger somebody. So I mean, there's a fine line, but I think that some of these guys relish pissing people off, and to me, it should be like not an unnecessary, but it should be sometimes unfortunate byproduct. But I think they sometimes relish it.
Right. I mean, to speak in the terms of, you don't want to be a stand patter and just do nothing, but you can't just go nuts and think you can do whatever you want all the time, and people are just going to accept whatever it is that you do. There's room between those two extremes to be a politician that moves the ball forward in your preferred direction without getting too far ahead of the public, and I don't feel like Republicans have found their sweet spot there yet. And I think I don't want to get into it right now, so we should probably wrap things up. But you and I talked about my Politico piece from earlier this week, how Republicans lost the culture war. So if you want to hear us talk about that, go on to Matt Lewis's podcast. You can tell him how to get there best. A lot of that just comes down to not accepting that there are limits to what you can accomplish. Maybe you can get some abortion restrictions. You're not going to overturn Roe v. Wade. You're not going to eliminate every possible exception to abortion in the world.
Well,
maybe
overturning Roe versus Wade just sends it back to the states. So that's not that of itself is not necessarily a radical thing to do. But I do agree with your general premise, Bill, which is to say you got to sort of know when to hold them and know when to fold them. And Kenny Rogers, vernacular, and you could argue that exceptions to abortion are ideologically inconsistent, but you also could argue, look, if you really care about saving the unborn, then you got to elect pro-life legislators, and the way to elect pro-life legislators is to have exceptions. And so sometimes you got to do what you got to do. Politics is messy. And we had this big discussion on the podcast, right? So everybody should read your Politico magazine piece, how Republicans lost the culture war, and they could check out my podcast where you and I talk about this for 30 minutes. And quite frankly, I think it's quite a good conversation we had.
I concur. But we should probably wrap things up here. Always good to talk to you, man.
Always good talking to you, Bill Scher. And check us out on Twitter at DMZ Show, Facebook /DMZ Show. Or tune in back here.
We got only 2 more. I'm sorry, we only got 2 more of these shows before Election Day.
Yes, that's right. So I think we had a good one today, and we talked a lot about elections. And this is our Super Bowl. This is our we're in our basically we're in our playoffs right now.
This is our Aussie Rules Grand Final,
and this is where I think we elevate our game a little bit, and we really bring it. So that's how we roll.
Till next week.
See you later.